My son locked me away for 730 days. He accused me of killing his unborn child, a child that never existed. He thinks today is just another Tuesday. He thinks I am broken, homeless, and powerless. He is wrong. Today is not just the day I walk free. It is the day the countdown to his absolute destruction begins. Before we dive into this nightmare, tell me in the comments, have you ever sacrificed everything for family only to be stabbed in the back? Hit that subscribe button, because you are going to want to see how this ends. The iron gate of the Illinois State Correctional Center slammed shut behind me with a finality that usually signals an ending. For me, that metallic clang was the starting gun. I stood on the concrete sidewalk, shivering slightly in the biting November wind. I was 72 years old. I was wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big, issued by the state, and I had $40 in cash in my pocket. I looked at the empty parking lot. Part of me, the foolish, sentimental part of a father, had expected to see a black sedan. I expected to see my son Brandon, standing there, with his head bowed, waiting to apologize. I expected him to say that the last 2 years were a misunderstanding, a terrible mistake that we could fix over a hot meal. But the parking lot was empty, just gray asphalt and a gray sky. Wait, there was one car. A dented silver Toyota Camry with an Uber sticker in the window idling near the curb. The driver rolled down the window. He was a young man, barely 20, chewing gum loudly. He looked at his phone, then at me. "Are you Augustus?" he asked. I nodded. "I am Augustus." The driver did not unlock the door. Instead, he reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a thick, yellow manila envelope. He held it out the window. "Ride is paid for," he said, "but the guy who ordered it said I had to give you this first." I took the envelope. It felt heavy. My hands, calloused from 2 years of working in the prison laundry, did not tremble. I ripped it open. Inside there was no letter. There was no welcome home card. There were no photos of the family I had not seen in 24 months. There was only a legal document, a court order. I adjusted my glasses and read the bold text at the top. Restraining order. State of Illinois versus Augustus King. Protected parties listed as Brandon King and Vanessa King. I read the terms. Augustus King is prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the protected parties. Augustus King is prohibited from contacting the protected parties via phone, email, or third party. Reason for order cited as credible threat of domestic violence and mental instability. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my chest. Domestic violence. Mental instability. My son had not sent a car to bring me home. He had sent a car to serve me a lawsuit. He wanted to make sure that the moment I stepped into freedom, I was already breaking the law if I tried to hug him. The driver unlocked the doors. "You getting in or what, old man? The destination is set for the downtown Motel 6. I opened the back door and slid onto the worn fabric seat. The car smelled of stale cigarette smoke and pine air freshener. "Take me to 104 Lakeshore Drive," I said. The driver looked in the rearview mirror. "App says Motel 6. I pulled a $20 bill from my pocket. It was half of my entire net worth at that moment. I placed it on the center console. I said, "Take me to Lakeshore Drive. I want to see my house." The driver shrugged and took the money. "You are the boss." As we drove toward the city, the skyline of Chicago rose up like a jagged row of teeth. I built half of those buildings. My company, King Enterprises, had poured the concrete and welded the steel that held this city together. I had spent 40 years building a legacy to hand down to my son, and this was my reward, a restraining order delivered by an Uber driver. We pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of King Manor. My grandfather built this estate. I had learned to walk in the gardens behind these walls. I had taught Brandon to ride a bike on this driveway. The gate was closed. I noticed immediately that the keypad had been changed. It used to be a simple brass panel. Now it was a high-tech biometric scanner with a camera lens staring directly at me. I got out of the car. The wind off the lake was brutal, cutting through my cheap suit. I walked up to the intercom and pressed the button. A voice crackled through the speaker. It was not a voice I recognized. "Identify yourself," the voice demanded. "This is Augustus King," I said, my voice steady. "Open the gate." There was a pause. Then the pedestrian door buzzed. I pushed it open and stepped into the courtyard. But before I could take 5 steps, a security guard stepped out from the booth. He was a large man wearing a tactical vest and resting his hand on a taser. "That is far enough, Mr. King," the guard said. "You are violating a court order. Step back, or I will be forced to restrain you." I looked up at the house. The massive oak front doors were closed, but above them on the stone balcony of the master bedroom, the French doors opened. Brandon stepped out. My son. He looked different. He was wearing a silk robe that I recognized. It was mine. He was holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey. He looked heavier, his face puffy from alcohol and excess. And then she stepped out behind him. Vanessa. She was wearing a white cashmere shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked radiant, healthy, and most importantly, she looked completely relaxed. My eyes dropped to her stomach. It was flat. "Well, look who it is," Brandon shouted down from the balcony. His voice slurred slightly. "The convict returns." "Brandon," I said. My voice was low, but in the stone courtyard it carried like thunder. "I see you got my mail." "You are trespassing, Gus." Brandon sneered. He did not call me Dad. He called me Gus. "You are 500 feet too close. Do you want to go back to a cell? I can call the sheriff right now." I ignored his threat. I looked at Vanessa. She was sipping her drink, watching me with a look of pure amusement, like she was watching a monkey in a zoo. "I see you have recovered from your tragic fall, Vanessa," I said. Vanessa smiled. It was a cold, reptilian smile. "It was a miracle, really," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "The doctors say my recovery was due to the emotional closure of seeing justice served. Knowing you were behind bars helped me heal, Augustus." I looked back at Brandon. "Is this what you wanted, son? You sent me away for 2 years. You took the company. You took the house. Is it enough?" Brandon laughed, but it was a nervous sound. He glanced at Vanessa, checking her reaction before he spoke. It was a subtle movement, but I caught it. He was afraid of her. "The house does not belong to you anymore," Brandon said, puffing out his chest. "It is part of the settlement. The judge awarded the estate to the Vanessa King Emotional Compensation Fund. You know, to pay for the trauma you caused her. We are just living here as caretakers of the fund." I felt a vein throb in my temple. The Emotional Compensation Fund. They had not just stolen my house. They had created a legal entity to launder the theft. And the baby I asked, the grandchild I supposedly killed. Brandon flinched. For a second, just a split second, I saw shame in his eyes. But Vanessa stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm, her nails digging into the silk of my robe. "We are trying again," Vanessa said smoothly. "But we cannot have a violent criminal around a newborn, can we? That is why you need to leave Augustus. Now." She pulled a phone from her pocket and held it up. "I have 911 on speed dial. Do not make me press send." The security guard took a step toward me, unholstering the taser. The electricity crackled blue and angry in the air. I looked at them. My son, the coward, and his mistress, the architect. They stood on my balcony, drinking my liquor, wearing my clothes, living in my house, threatening me with my own security system. They expected me to beg. They expected me to fall to my knees and plead for forgiveness. They expected the broken old man they had manufactured in their minds. Instead, I smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile I used to wear in boardrooms right before I acquired a rival company and fired their entire executive team. "Enjoy the view, Brandon," I said. "Enjoy the champagne. Because everything you see, everything you touch is temporary. You did not inherit an empire today. You just leased a war zone." I turned my back on them. I walked back to the Uber with my head held high. Behind me, I heard Brandon shouting something about being a senile old fool, but his voice sounded thin and weak against the wind. I got back into the car. The driver was staring at me with wide eyes. "Dude," he said, "that was intense. Are we going to the Motel 6 now?" "Yes," I said. "Take me to the motel." As the car pulled away, I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. I closed my eyes and let the anger wash over me. It was not a hot, burning fire anymore. It was a cold, hard block of ice in my gut. My mind drifted back. 2 years ago. The staircase. I remembered the argument. I had found out that Vanessa was lying about her family background. She claimed to be from old money in Connecticut, but my private investigator had found nothing. I had confronted her at the top of the stairs. I told her I would cut Brandon out of the will if he married her. She had screamed. She had thrown herself at me, clawing at my face. I grabbed her wrists to stop her. I pushed her back gently, just to create space. And then she threw herself backward. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. She didn't trip. She launched herself. She tumbled down the carpeted steps, screaming all the way down. When she landed at the bottom, she lay still. Then the blood. I remembered the blood on her white dress. Bright red. Too bright. Brandon had run in from the garden. He saw me at the top of the stairs. He saw her at the bottom. "You killed him," Vanessa had shrieked. "You killed our baby." I remembered the police interrogation. The detective telling me that Brandon had given a statement. He said he saw me push her. He said I had been threatening to kill the baby for weeks. My lawyer had begged me to fight it, but then Brandon came to visit me in the holding cell. He was crying. He told me the investors were pulling out of the IPO because of the scandal. He said the company's stock was crashing. He said if I went to trial, the family name would be dragged through the mud for months. "Just take the plea, Dad," he had sobbed. "Take the plea for involuntary manslaughter." 2 years. You will be out in 1 with good behavior. Please. Do it for the company. Do it for me. I need to focus on Vanessa. She is devastated. I did it. I took the fall. I plead guilty to harming a woman and a child I would have died to protect. I did it because I thought my son was a grieving father trying to save our legacy. I opened my eyes. The taxi was merging onto the highway. I was a fool. There was no baby. I knew that now. The recovery was too fast. The lack of medical records. The sudden transfer of assets. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled restraining order. I smoothed it out on my knee. Brandon thought this piece of paper was a shield. He thought it would keep me away. He didn't understand. This wasn't a wall. It was a map. It showed me exactly where they were vulnerable. They had cited mental instability as the reason for the order. Good. Let them think I am crazy. Let them think I am a senile old man shouting at gates, because nobody looks for a knife in the hand of a victim. The driver looked back at me again. "You okay back there, man? You got really quiet." "I am better than okay, son," I said, staring at the gray city passing by. "I am focused." The car slowed down as we approached the Motel 6. It was a rundown building with peeling yellow paint and a neon sign that flickered ominously. It was a long way from King Manor, but it was perfect. It was close to the ground. I stepped out of the car. I didn't look like a threat. I looked like a tragedy. But as I walked into the lobby smelling of bleach and despair, I wasn't thinking about where I would sleep. I was thinking about the 40% voting shares that were still in my name. I was thinking about the secret safe deposit box in Zurich that Brandon didn't know existed. And I was thinking about Mitchell Graves, the only lawyer in Chicago who hated my son as much as I did. I walked up to the receptionist, a tired woman with heavy makeup. "Name?" she asked, not looking up. "Augustus," I said. She typed it in. "Cash or card?" I put my last $20 on the counter. "Cash," I said. "And I need a phone book." She laughed. "A phone book? Honey, nobody uses phone books anymore. Use the Wi-Fi." I smiled. "I don't want to look up a number. I want to rip a page out." My son had imprisoned me for a crime I didn't commit. He had stolen 2 years of my life. He had taken my home. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had left me with nothing to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. I took my keycard and walked toward room 104. The game had officially begun. The neon sign outside my window buzzed like a dying insect. It flashed pink, then black, then pink again, illuminating the stained carpet of room 104. The air conditioner rattled in the corner, coughing out air that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. For a man who had spent 40 years sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets in a climate-controlled master suite, this should have been hell. But after 2 years on a prison cot, this lumpy mattress felt like a cloud. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the peeling wallpaper. I was not feeling sorry for myself. Self-pity is a luxury for people who have time to waste, and I did not have a second to spare. I was mentally cataloging every asset I remembered Brandon had access to: the offshore accounts, the blind trusts, the real estate holdings. I was building a map of my enemy's resources in my mind. Then came the knock. It was not the polite tap of a maid. It was a sharp, impatient pounding. 3 rapid strikes. I knew that knock. I had heard it on my office door 1,000 times when my son wanted money for a new sports car or a bailout for a failed investment. I stood up and opened the door. Brandon stood there, framed by the peeling paint of the doorframe like a diamond in a dumpster. He was wearing a charcoal Italian wool suit that cost more than the entire motel was worth. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the grime of the walkway. He held a handkerchief over his nose, looking at me with a mixture of disgust and pity. "May I come in?" he asked, although his tone suggested he would rather step into a sewer. I stepped back, allowing him to enter. He walked to the center of the small room, careful not to let his expensive coat touch the walls or the furniture. He looked around at the cheap television, the flickering lamp, and the half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand. "Jesus, Dad," he muttered, his voice muffled by the handkerchief. "You cannot live like this. It is embarrassing." I sat back down on his bed. I did not offer him a seat. There was only one chair, and it was covered in suspicious stains. "I live where I can afford, Brandon," I said, my voice calm. "Since my bank accounts are frozen and my home has been seized by your wife, this is what is left." Brandon sighed and finally lowered the handkerchief. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes that the expensive moisturizer could not hide. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white envelope. He tossed it onto the bed next to me. It landed with a soft thud. I picked it up. Inside was a check and a boarding pass. I looked at the check first. $5,000, signed by Brandon King. The memo line read consulting fee. Then I looked at the boarding pass. One way, first class, Chicago to Boca Raton, Florida, departing tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. "What is this?" I asked, holding up the paper. "It is a fresh start," Brandon said, putting his hands in his pockets and trying to look benevolent. "Vanessa and I talked. We do not want you to suffer. We are not monsters, Gus. We just want what is best for everyone." I looked at the check again. $5,000. That was what I used to spend on a single dinner with clients. Now my son was offering it to me as the price of my entire life. "You want me to retire," I said. "To Florida." "I want you to be comfortable," Brandon corrected quickly. "Look, Chicago is not for you anymore. The winters are too cold for your joints. And frankly, your presence here is complicated." "Complicated," I repeated. Brandon started pacing the small room, his shoes clicking on the linoleum. "Yes, complicated. We are weeks away from the initial public offering. The IPO is the biggest moment in the history of King Enterprises. Wall Street is watching us like hawks. The investors want stability. They want a clean image. And a father who just got out of prison for domestic abuse is not a clean image," I said, finishing his thought. "Exactly." Brandon stopped pacing and looked at me. His eyes were pleading, but there was a hardness behind them. "If the press finds out you are living in a place like this, they will have a field day. They will paint me as the ungrateful son. They will say the company is unstable. The stock price will tank before we even ring the bell." "So you are not here because you care about me," I said, placing the check back on the bed. "You are here because you are afraid. You are afraid I will talk to the reporters. I am here to offer you a graceful exit," Brandon snapped, his patience fraying. "Take the money, go to Florida, sit on a beach, drink margaritas. I will send you $5,000 every month. You will never have to work again. You can disappear." Disappear. That was the word that hung in the air. He did not just want me gone. He wanted me erased. He wanted to wipe away the man who built the chair he sat in. I stood up slowly. I was 72 years old, but I drew myself up to my full height. I was still taller than him. I walked over to the window and looked out at the flashing neon sign. "I remember when you were 6 years old." "Brandon," I said, keeping my back to him. "You stole a candy bar from the corner store. When I caught you, you tried to give me $1 from your piggy bank to make me forget it. You thought money could fix your morality." "Dad, stop," Brandon groaned. "You haven't changed," I continued, turning to face him. "You are still that little boy trying to buy his way out of trouble. But the price has gone up, and I am not selling." Brandon Seth's face flushed red. He took a step toward me, his fists clenched. "You are being stubborn, old man. You have nothing, no money, no friends, no reputation. If you stay here, you will rot. Do you think anyone will hire you? Do you think anyone will listen to you? You are a convicted felon. I am giving you a lifeline. Take it." I looked at the check on the bed. Then I looked at the plane ticket. I picked them up. Brandon S.'s shoulders relaxed. He thought he had won. "Good decision, Dad. The car will be here at 4 a.m. to take you to the airport." I ripped the check in half. Then I ripped the plane ticket. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the small room. I let the pieces flutter to the dirty carpet like snow. Brandon stared at the confetti on the floor, his mouth open in shock. "You are insane," he whispered. "That was $5,000. I stepped closer to him until I could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath. "I do not want your money, Brandon, and I do not want your pity. And most of all, I do not want your permission to exist." I pointed to the door. "Get out." Brandon stared at me for a long moment. The fear was back in his eyes, replacing the arrogance. He realized that he had no leverage. He realized that money had no power over a man who had already lost everything. "Fine," he spat, straightening his jacket. "Stay here. Rot in this filth. But do not expect another dime from me. When you are starving in the street, do not come crawling to my gate." "I will not come to your gate, Brandon," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the wind outside. "I will be much closer than that." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the cheap picture frame on the wall rattled. I stood alone in the silence of the room. I looked down at the torn check on the floor. $5,000. It could have bought me hot meals for a month. It could have bought me new clothes. But it could not buy me what I really wanted. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. Across the city, the glass tower of King Enterprises pierced the night sky. The lights were on in the executive suite on the top floor. My old office. I am not going to Florida, I said to the empty room. I sat back down on the bed and pulled a small notebook from my pocket. I opened it to a fresh page. I am staying right here. I am going to buy a front row seat. And I am going to watch you put on a show. And when the curtain falls on your little play, Brandon, I will be the one turning off the lights. The diner was called Sal's, but Sal had probably died 20 years ago, leaving behind a legacy of grease and flickering fluorescent lights. It was located in the shadow of the train tracks on the south side of Chicago, a place where people went when they did not want to be found. It was the perfect place for a dead man to meet a ghost. I sat in the back booth facing the door. My coffee had gone cold 10 minutes ago, but I did not ask for a refill. I was too busy watching the entrance. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my hand tightened around the butter knife on the table. Prison had taught me that relaxation was a fatal mistake. Then Mitchell Graves walked in. He did not look like the shark who used to bill me $1,000 an hour to negotiate skyscrapers. He looked older. His gray hair was thinning, and his trench coat was wet from the relentless rain. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp and calculating, before they landed on me. He did not smile. He simply walked over and slid into the booth opposite me. "You look like hell, Gus," he said quietly. "I feel like it," I replied, my voice raspy. "I assume you did not come here to critique my appearance, Mitchell. Did you bring it?" Mitchell sighed and signaled the waitress for a black coffee. He waited until she had poured the sludge into a mug and walked away before he reached into his wet coat. He pulled out a thick brown envelope sealed with heavy tape. He placed it on the sticky table between us, but kept his hand on it. "Before I give you this, you need to understand something," Gus Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What is in here changes everything. It is not just evidence. It is a declaration of war. Once you see this, there is no going back. There is no settlement. There is only destruction." "Give it to me," I said, reaching for the envelope. Mitchell pulled it back slightly. "I am serious. I broke 17 privacy laws to get this. If the Bar Association finds out, I am disbarred. If Vanessa finds out, I am dead." I looked at my old friend. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Tell me how you got it," I demanded. Mitchell leaned in closer. "You know, Vanessa claimed she was treated at St. Mary's after the fall, but there were no records there. She said they were lost. Convenient, right? So I started digging into her past. Not the fake past, she told Brandon. Her real past. I found a trail of credit card payments from an alias she used 6 years ago. Elena Rodriguez. The payments were to a private women's clinic in Guadalajara, Mexico. Mexico, I asked. Yes. It was a high-end clinic for discreet procedures. But the clinic closed down 2 years ago due to a tax scandal. The records were supposed to be destroyed. Mitchell took a sip of his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. But nothing is ever really destroyed, Gus. Not if you have enough money. I found the former administrator of the clinic. He was living in a shack in Tijuana. I paid him $10,000 cash. He took me to a storage locker filled with boxes of files. We spent 3 days digging through dust and cockroaches, and I asked my heart hammering against my ribs. Mitchell slid the envelope across the table. "Open it." I tore the tape. My fingers felt numb. I pulled out a stack of photocopied medical documents. They were in Spanish, but there was a translated copy attached to the front. Patient name Elena Rodriguez, alias Vanessa King, date of birth matches, social security number matches. I flipped to the second page. It was a surgical report dated 8 years ago. I read the words, but my brain refused to process them at first. Total abdominal hysterectomy. Indication: severe endometriosis and complications from prior termination. I looked up at Mitchell. Hysterectomy, I whispered. Mitchell nodded grimly. She had her uterus removed when she was 20 years old, Gus. She cannot get pregnant. She has not been able to get pregnant for nearly a decade. The diner seemed to spin around me. The noise of the cutlery clinking against plates faded into a dull roar. I thought about the pregnancy tests she had left on the bathroom counter for Brandon to find. Fake. I thought about the ultrasound pictures she had framed and put on the mantel. Fake. Purchased online. I thought about the morning sickness, the cravings, the baby bump that was just starting to show before she fell. All of it. A performance. A meticulous, cruel, terrifying performance. She was never pregnant, I said, my voice rising. Keep it down, Mitchell hissed, looking around. No, she was never pregnant. There was no baby to kill Gus. The fall down the stairs was staged. She probably used a blood pack from a movie prop store. She blamed you for killing a ghost. My hands started to shake. Not from age. Not from cold. From a rage so hot, it felt like I had swallowed a live coal. I had spent 730 days in a 6x8 cell. I had been beaten. I had been spat on. I had lost my dignity, my home, and my name, all for a crime that was biologically impossible. She destroyed me for nothing, I said. Not for nothing, Mitchell corrected. Look at the last page. I turned to the back of the file. It was a copy of a transfer deed. 2 weeks after you were sentenced, Brandon transferred 40% of his personal stock holdings to a blind trust. The beneficiary of that trust is Vanessa. He did it out of guilt. He thought he had failed her. He thought he had lost their child. He gave her $50 million worth of stock as an apology. $50 million. That was the price of my freedom. Does Brandon know? I asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mitchell rubbed his temples. That is the $20 million question. Is your son a victim of the greatest con artist in Chicago, or is he a co-conspirator? Did she fool him too, or did he know she was barren and went along with it just to get you out of the way? I thought about Brandon's face on the balcony today. I thought about the fear in his eyes when he looked at Vanessa. He knows, I said. I felt it in my gut. Maybe he did not know at first, but he knows now. And he is too much of a coward to admit it. He would rather let his father rot in prison than admit he married a monster. I closed the file. The paper felt hot to the touch. This is it, I said. This is how I kill them. Not yet, Mitchell warned. If you go to the police now with just photocopies, they will claim they are forged. Vanessa will sue you for defamation. We need the originals. We need a doctor to testify. We need to trap them in a lie so big they cannot climb out of it. I looked at the window. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the grime off the city streets. But it could not wash away the filth I had just uncovered. I am not going to the police, Mitchell, I said. Not yet. I am going to let them think they have won. I am going to let them ring that bell at the stock exchange. I am going to let them climb to the very top of the mountain. And then I asked Mitchell, and then I am going to show the world that they are standing on a graveyard of lies. I stood up. I tucked the envelope inside my cheap jacket next to my heart. It was my armor. It was my weapon. Thank you, Mitchell, I said. Mitchell didn't stand up. Where are you going, Gus? I am going back to my observation post, I said. I have a lot of work to do. And Mitchell, yeah, get your best suit ready. When this bomb goes off, I want you standing right next to me in the rubble. Mitchell finally smiled. It was a sharp, predatory smile. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I walked out of the diner and into the rain. I didn't feel the cold anymore. I walked with the stride of a man who knew the ending of the story. My son had sent a lamb to the slaughterhouse, but the lamb had died in that cell. The thing that walked out was a wolf, and the wolf was hungry. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the storage facility on the outskirts of town. It was a self-storage unit I had rented 10 years ago under the name of a shell company. I had paid the fees a decade in advance. Brandon knew about my bank accounts. He knew about my stock portfolio. He knew about the vacation homes. But he did not know about Unit 412. I rolled up the metal door. Inside was a dusty sedan covered in a tarp and a single fireproof safe. I spun the dial. Right to 17, left to 4, right to 72. The lock clicked with a satisfying mechanical thud. Inside were stacks of non-sequential $100 bills. My emergency fund. My war chest. I filled a duffel bag with $50,000. It was enough to buy a ghost a new life. 2 hours later, I stood in the leasing office of the Skyline Towers. It was a high-rise residential building directly across the street from the King Enterprises headquarters. I did not fill out an application. I did not give them a social security number. I placed 6 months of rent in cash on the desk. The leasing agent, a young man with more ambition than curiosity, counted the money and handed me a key. No questions asked. Cash is the only language that everyone in Chicago speaks fluently. The apartment was on the 32nd floor. It was empty. No furniture. No pictures. No warmth. It smelled of fresh paint and industrial cleaner. Perfect. I did not need a home. I needed a blind. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Directly across the street, about 200 yards away, was my old office. I could see the mahogany desk I had imported from Italy. I could see the leather chair where I had made decisions that shaped the skyline of this city. And I could see him. Brandon was pacing back and forth in front of the window. He was waving his arms, arguing with someone on the phone. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. He looked like a trapped animal. I went out and bought the necessary equipment. I did not buy a television or a bed. I bought a high-powered telescope on a tripod. I bought a pair of military-grade binoculars. I bought a whiteboard and dry erase markers. I bought a pot of coffee and a sleeping bag. I set up my station. The telescope was trained on the executive suite. The binoculars were for the boardroom on the floor below. I unwrapped the medical file Mitchell had given me and taped the pages to the window glass right next to my view of the office. Now I could see the truth and the lie in the same field of vision. I spent the next 3 days watching. I learned their routine better than they knew it themselves. Vanessa usually arrived at 11 a.m. She would sweep into the office wearing designer clothes that cost more than my son's annual salary used to be. I watched through the lens as she berated the secretaries. I saw her throw a file at an intern. I saw the way she looked at Brandon, not with love, but with contempt. She was the puppet master, and my son was just a terrified marionette dancing on her strings. I saw Brandon popping pills. He would open the bottom drawer of the desk when he thought no one was looking and swallow 2 or 3 white tablets. Stress, anxiety, guilt. They were eating him alive from the inside out. He was terrified of the IPO. He was terrified of the investors. But mostly, he was terrified of the woman sitting on the sofa in his office checking her nails while the company burned. I started taking notes on the whiteboard. Timestamps, behaviors, visitors. I was building a profile of their destruction. I ate cold sandwiches and drank black coffee. I slept on the floor in short bursts, waking up every few hours to check the window. I was not living. I was hunting. On the 3rd night, I saw something that made me smile for the first time in years. It was late. The cleaning crew had already left. Brandon was alone in the office. He was sitting at my desk with his head in his hands. He looked small, He looked defeated. He opened the safe behind the desk. My safe. He pulled out a bottle of scotch and poured a drink. Then he pulled out a picture frame. I adjusted the focus on the telescope. It was a picture of me and him, taken 10 years ago on a fishing trip. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then he smashed it face down on the desk and wept. I lowered the binoculars. I did not feel pity. Pity is for the weak. I felt validation. He knew what he had done. The guilt was a cancer, and it was terminal. I walked over to the whiteboard and wrote a single sentence in red marker. He is ready to break. I turned off the lights in the apartment, so I would be invisible in the reflection of the glass. I stood in the darkness, a silent sentinel overlooking the kingdom I had built and lost. The stage was set. The actors were in place. They thought they were running a company. They did not know they were starring in a tragedy. And the director had just taken his seat. Tomorrow, the IPO roadshow began. Tomorrow, they would try to sell their lies to the world. I lay down on the sleeping bag, my eyes fixed on the lighted window across the street. Sleep well, my son. Because when you wake up, the nightmare begins. The lens of the telescope cut through the morning haze like a sniper scope finding its target. From my vantage point on the 32nd floor, I had a front row seat to the collapse of an empire. Across the street in the executive boardroom of King Enterprises, the panic was visible to the naked eye. I did not need audio to understand the language of fear. I had spoken it fluently in business dealings for 40 years. I adjusted the focus knob. The image sharpened. There were 6 men in the boardroom. 5 of them were the lead underwriters from the investment banks. They were men who smelled blood in the water. They were standing up, gathering their papers and shaking their heads. Their body language was aggressive. One of them, a heavy-set man in a navy suit, slammed a folder onto the mahogany table. He pointed a finger at Brandon. My son was shrinking. That was the only way to describe it. Physically, he was sitting in the CEO chair, the chair I had sat in for decades, but he looked like a child wearing his father's clothes. He was sweating. I could see the sheen on his forehead, even from 200 yards away. He was pleading with them. His hands were moving frantically, palms up in the universal gesture of begging. I took a sip of black coffee and leaned back against the cold glass of my window. I knew exactly what was happening. The underwriters had done their final due diligence. They had looked at the corporate bylaws, and they had found the landmine I buried there 20 years ago. The Class A voting shares. When my wife Beatrice died, she left her voting shares to me. Those shares carried veto power over any public listing. When I went to prison, Brandon assumed those rights transferred to him automatically as the acting CEO. He was wrong. The bylaws stated clearly that in the event of the primary holder's incapacitation, the shares could only be transferred with a wet ink signature witnessed by a notary. Without my signature, the IPO was illegal. Without the IPO, the bank loans that Brandon had taken out to fund Vanessa's lavish lifestyle would default. I watched the bankers walk out. They did not shake Brandon's hand. They just left. The room emptied, leaving my son alone at the head of the table. He put his head in his hands and pulled at his hair. He looked like he was about to scream. Then the door opened again. Vanessa walked in. She did not look panicked. She looked annoyed. She was wearing a red dress that looked like a wound against the gray tones of the office. She walked over to Brandon and spun his chair around so he had to look at her. I picked up my binoculars to get a closer look at her face. Her expression was hard. She was not comforting him. She was interrogating him. I saw her lips move. She was speaking fast. She pointed at the door where the bankers had just left. Then she pointed at the phone on the desk. Brandon shook his head. He looked terrified. He was resisting. Vanessa grabbed his face. She dug her fingers into his cheeks, forcing him to look her in the eye. It was a gesture of dominance, not affection. She leaned in close. I imagined what she was saying. She was reminding him of the debts. She was reminding him of the sham marriage. She was reminding him that if the company failed, they would both be on the street. She released him. Brandon slumped in the chair, defeated. He nodded slowly. Vanessa smiled. It was that same cold, reptilian smile I had seen at the gate. She picked up the handset of the secure landline on the desk and handed it to him. In my empty apartment, the cheap burner phone I had bought yesterday began to ring. I looked at the phone buzzing on the floor. Then I looked through the telescope. I watched my son holding the receiver to his ear, his eyes closed in prayer. He was calling the number he thought belonged to a desperate, homeless old man. He thought he was calling a victim. I let it ring. One ring. I took a bite of my toast. 2 rings. I watched Brandon tap his fingers nervously on the desk. 3 rings. Vanessa leaned over the desk, whispering into his other ear, coaching him. 4 rings. I picked up the phone and pressed the decline button. Through the telescope, I saw Brandon slam the receiver down. He looked up at Vanessa and shook his head. He is not answering. That is what he said. I could read it on his lips. Vanessa did not get angry. She started pacing. She was thinking. She walked to the window and looked out. For a second, she looked straight at my building. I stood perfectly still in the darkness of my room, even though I knew she could not see me. She was looking for a solution. Then how she snapped her fingers. She turned back to Brandon. She was animated now. She was acting out a scene. She put her hand on her chest, looking sorrowful. Then she wiped away a fake tear. She pointed to the calendar on the wall. I knew what she was doing. She was rewriting the script. If intimidation did not work and bribery did not work, they would go to the only weapon they had left. Emotional manipulation. The pity trap. She walked over to Brandon and massaged his shoulders. She was playing the supportive wife now. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. It was the kiss of Judas. She pulled a piece of paper from her notebook and started writing. She was drafting a speech. She handed it to Brandon. He read it and looked up at her doubtfully. She nodded firmly. She tapped the paper. Say this, she was telling him. Say this, and he will crumble. They were going to invite me back. Not to the house that was too risky. They were going to invite me to a public event. A place where I would feel pressured to act like a civilized human being. A place where I would be surrounded by the very people who used to respect me. I watched Brandon pick up his cell phone this time. He typed a text message. My burner phone buzzed again. A single text. Dad, please. I know you are angry. You have every right to be. But I am in trouble. Real trouble. The stress. It is too much. I think I am having a breakdown. I need my father. Please come to the foundation gala tonight. Just to talk. No lawyers. No Vanessa. Just us. I will leave a ticket at the door. I looked up from the phone to the window. Brandon was staring at his phone screen, waiting for a reply. Vanessa was standing behind him, watching like a vulture waiting for a carcass. They thought I was weak. They thought that despite everything, the tug of fatherhood would still work. They thought that if Brandon cried wolf one more time, I would come running to save the flock. They were right about one thing. I would come. But I was not coming to save the flock. I was coming to burn down the pasture. I typed a reply. 2 words. What time? Through the telescope, I saw Brandon jump out of his chair. He showed the phone to Vanessa. She high-fived him. They hugged. It was a celebration of deceit. They thought they had hooked the fish. I put down the binoculars and walked to the closet. Hanging there inside a plastic dry cleaning bag was the only thing I had managed to salvage from my storage unit, besides cash. My old tuxedo. It was a little out of style, perhaps a bit dusty, but it was cut by a master tailor in London. I ran my hand over the lapel. Tonight I would walk into the lion's den. I would let them think they had won. I would let them think I was the same soft, sentimental old fool who took the fall for a fake pregnancy. I would sign their paper. Oh yes, I would sign it. But I would sign it with ink that would disappear before the ink on their victory champagne had dried. I looked back out the window one last time. Brandon and Vanessa were pouring drinks now. They were toasting to their brilliance. "Drink up, children," I whispered. "Enjoy the taste, because tomorrow you will be drinking ash." The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel smelled of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. I had built this room 40 years ago. I had chosen the Italian marble for the floors and the Austrian crystal for the chandeliers. Tonight, however, I was not walking in as the architect. I was walking in as the ghost. I paused at the top of the grand staircase. My tuxedo was 20 years old. It smelled faintly of mothballs and cedar storage. It was a stark contrast to the sea of new silk and velvet swirling below me. I took a deep breath. This was it, the greatest performance of my life. I let my shoulders slump forward. I relaxed the muscles in my face, letting my jaw hang slightly loose. I started a subtle tremor in my right hand. I was no longer Augustus King, the tycoon. I was Gus, the broken old ex-convict. I began to descend the stairs. I took each step slowly, gripping the banister as if I were terrified of falling. Heads began to turn. The whispers started like a ripple in a pond and quickly turned into a wave. "Look, is that him? Is that Augustus King? I thought he was in prison. He looks terrible. God, he looks like a homeless person." I heard every word. I saw the sneers on the faces of men I had made rich. I saw the women pulling their clutches tighter as I passed. They parted for me not out of respect, but out of disgust. They treated me like a disease they were afraid to catch. I kept my eyes on the floor, shuffling my feet. Inside, I was laughing. Let them sneer. Their contempt was my camouflage. Then I saw them. They were standing near the center of the room by a massive ice sculpture of the King Enterprises logo. Brandon looked dashing in a bespoke tuxedo, but his smile was tight. He was sweating. He kept checking his watch. Vanessa was next to him, wearing a shimmering silver gown that clung to her body like a second skin. She was holding a glass of champagne and laughing at something a senator was saying. Then she saw me. Her expression froze for a fraction of a second. I saw the calculation behind her eyes. She tapped Brandon on the shoulder. He turned. When he saw me, his face went pale. He looked like he wanted to run. But Vanessa squeezed his arm hard. I saw her whisper something to him. Probably a command. "Showtime." Vanessa handed her glass to a waiter and rushed toward me. She moved with the grace of a predator. Her face transformed instantly from cold calculation to overwhelming relief. "Dad," she cried out. Her voice was loud enough for half the room to hear. "Oh, Dad, you came." She threw her arms around me. She smelled of Chanel and deception. I felt her body tense against mine. She was not hugging a father. She was hugging a problem she needed to solve. I let out a shaky breath and patted her back awkwardly. "Hello, Vanessa," I stammered, making my voice sound thin and reedy. She pulled back and held my face in her hands. Her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. It was a masterclass in acting. "We were so worried about you," she said loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "We have been looking everywhere. Why did you run away from the house? We just wanted to help you." I looked around at the crowd. They were watching us with rapt attention. The narrative was shifting. I was no longer the villain. I was the confused old man, and she was the saintly daughter-in-law trying to save him. I didn't know," I said, looking down at my shoes. "The police, the order." I was scared. Brandon stepped forward. He looked less convincing than Vanessa, but he was trying. "Dad," he said. His voice cracked. He reached out and took my trembling hand. "Forget the police. Forget the order. We are family. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything." He pulled me into a hug. I felt his heart hammering against my chest. He was terrified. He was shaking almost as much as I was pretending to. "I missed you, Dad," he whispered in my ear. I stiffened. That was the first truth he had spoken. He did miss me. He missed my money. He missed my protection. He missed having someone to fix his mistakes. I pulled away slowly and looked him in the eye. I needed to test him. I needed to give him one last chance to be a human being before I destroyed him. "Brandon," I said, my voice trembling. "The baby. Is it true? Are you really trying again?" Brandon blinked. He glanced quickly at Vanessa. She gave him a microscopic nod. "Yes, Dad," he said. "We are. We want to give you a grandchild. We want to start over. The miscarriage, it broke us, but having you back, it heals everything." There it was. The lie. He looked me in the eye and used a dead imaginary child as a bargaining chip. He sold his soul right there on the ballroom floor. I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. There was no saving him. He was not a victim. He was a willing participant. I squeezed his hand. I forced a tear to roll down my cheek. "I am so glad, son," I whispered. "I am so glad. I was afraid. I was afraid I had lost you forever." Vanessa beamed. She turned to the crowd and wiped her eyes dramatically. "Isn't this wonderful?" she declared. "The family is reunited." The crowd applauded. Polite golf claps rippled through the room. They ate it up. The prodigal father returning to the benevolent son. It was the perfect story for the evening news. "Come, Dad," Vanessa said, linking her arm through mine. "Come sit in the VIP section. You must be hungry. We have so much to discuss." She led me toward the head table. I walked slowly, leaning heavily on her arm like an invalid. "You know, Dad," Brandon said, walking on my other side. "The investors are here tonight. They were asking about you. They were worried about the transition." I stopped walking. I looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "The transition?" I asked. "Yes," Brandon said, licking his lips nervously. "The IPO. We need to show a united front. We need to show them that you support me. That you support us." I looked at Vanessa. She was smiling encouragement, but her eyes were hard as flint. "I just want to help," I said softly. "I am old, Brandon, old. I am tired. Prison. It took something from me. I do not understand business anymore. The world moves too fast." Vanessa squeezed my arm. "That is exactly why you should retire, Dad," she said soothingly. "You deserve to rest. You deserve peace. Let Brandon carry the burden now. That is what a good father does, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. That is what a good father does." Brandon let out a breath he had been holding for 10 minutes. He thought he had me. He thought the senile old man had accepted his fate. "We have some papers prepared," Brandon said, trying to sound casual. "Just formalities, really. Reaffirming your support. Transferring the voting rights so you don't have to worry about board meetings anymore. We can sign them later tonight. After the speeches." I looked at him. I looked at the sweat on his brow. I looked at the desperation in his eyes. "Of course, son," I said. "I will sign anything. I just want this nightmare to be over." Vanessa smiled. A genuine smile this time. The smile of a thief who had just cracked the safe. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "You are doing the right thing." They led me to the table. They pulled out my chair. They poured me a glass of expensive wine. They sat on either side of me, boxing me in. They thought they were my jailers. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like victory. I looked around the room at the investors, the bankers, the socialites. They were all looking at us, nodding approvingly. They saw a happy family. I saw a crime scene. I reached into my pocket and touched the pen I had brought with me. It was a special pen. The ink inside was formulated to vanish completely within 12 hours of contact with paper. I looked at Brandon. He was laughing at something Vanessa said, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Laugh, my son, I thought. Laugh while you can. Because I am not just going to sign your papers. I am going to sign your death warrant. And I am going to do it with a smile on my face. The waiter brought the first course. It was lobster bisque. My favorite. I picked up my spoon, my hand still shaking for the benefit of the audience. This looks delicious, I said. And it was. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served cold. But tonight, I was going to serve it hot, right in the middle of a black tie gala. The lawyer placed the documents on the white tablecloth, right next to my half-eaten lobster bisque. His name was Sterling, and he was one of the men who had helped structure the plea deal that sent me to prison. He did not look me in the eye. He just pointed to the line at the bottom of the page marked grantor. Sign here, Mr. King, Sterling said softly. Press hard. It is a carbon copy. I looked at the paper. It was a transfer of voting rights and irrevocable proxy. It gave Brandon full authority to vote my shares in any board meeting. It gave him the power to sell the company, to merge it, or to burn it to the ground. It was the key to the kingdom. Brandon leaned in close. He smelled of sweat and expensive cologne. Here, Dad, use my pen, he said, pulling a gold-plated Mont Blanc from his jacket pocket. It is the one you gave me for graduation. I looked at the gold pen. I remembered buying it. I remembered thinking that one day he would use it to sign treaties or charitable grants. Instead, he was using it to sign his father's death warrant. I shook my head slowly. My hand trembled as I reached into my own pocket. No, son, I said, my voice raspy. I want to use my own. It is the pen I used to sign the deed for this building 40 years ago. It brings me luck. Vanessa rolled her eyes. She clearly thought I was being sentimental and delay the inevitable. Just let him use his old pen, Brandon, she hissed. Let us get this over with. I pulled out the silver Parker pen. It looked ordinary. It looked slightly tarnished, but inside the barrel was a cartridge of ink I had purchased from a chemist in Germany. It was a formula used by spies during the Cold War. It was vibrant dark blue when wet. It dried quickly. But upon exposure to oxygen for more than 8 hours, the chemical bonds would break down. The pigment would evaporate into the air, leaving the paper as white as snow. I uncapped the pen. The click sounded like a gunshot in the hush of the table. I lowered the nib to the paper. I felt Brandon holding his breath. I felt Vanessa leaning in her perfume, clouding my senses. I felt the eyes of the investors at the next table drilling into my back. I started to write. A UG. My hand shook violently. I made the signature look jagged and weak, the scrawl of a man who was losing control of his faculties. USTUS, I paused. I looked up at Brandon. Are you sure this is what is best for the company, son? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Brandon nodded vigorously. Yes, Dad. Yes. It is the only way to save everything. Please, finish it. I looked back down. K-I-N-G. I finished the signature with a flourish. The blue ink glistened on the white page. It looked permanent. It looked binding. It looked like surrender. Brandon snatched the paper away before the ink was even dry. He stared at it as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He let out a laugh, a loud barking sound of pure relief. "He did it," Vanessa whispered. She grabbed the document from Brandon and checked it herself. She ran her finger over the signature. She looked at me with a smirk that was pure triumph. "Thank you, Augustus," she said, dropping the act of the sweet daughter-in-law. "You finally did something useful." She handed the document to Sterling. "File this immediately," she ordered. "I want this registered with the SEC before the market opens tomorrow morning." Sterling nodded and placed the document into his leather briefcase. He locked it. Click. I sat back in my chair and folded my hands. I looked tired. Inside, I was counting. 12 hours. That was the window. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, when the banks opened to underwrite the IPO, that signature would be nothing but a memory. Brandon stood up. He tapped his spoon against his champagne glass. The sharp ring cut through the chatter of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brandon boomed, his voice full of restored confidence. "May I have your attention, please?" The room went silent. All faces turned to the head table. "Tonight is a historic night for King Enterprises," Brandon announced, puffing out his chest. "For the past 2 years, there have been rumors. There have been doubts about the leadership of our great company. But tonight, I am proud to announce that my father, Augustus King, has officially given his full blessing to the new direction of the firm." Applause broke out. It was polite at first, then enthusiastic as the investors realized their money was safe. Brandon gestured to me. I stayed seated, looking small and frail. "My father has just signed the transfer of voting rights," Brandon continued. "He has passed the torch. He recognizes that the future belongs to the next generation. This IPO will go forward as planned, and tomorrow King Enterprises will not just be a family business. It will be a global powerhouse." The crowd cheered. Flashbulbs popped, blinding me. Brandon raised his glass high. "To family," Brandon shouted. "And to the future." "To the future," the crowd echoed. Vanessa leaned over and kissed Brandon on the cheek. They posed for the photographers, the golden couple, the winners. They looked radiant. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. I watched them preen. I watched them bask in the adoration of the crowd. They were so busy looking at the cameras, they did not see the wolf sitting right next to them. I looked at the briefcase sitting by Sterling's feet. The bomb was armed. The timer was ticking. Brandon sat back down, his face flushed with adrenaline. He looked at me. "You did good, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder patronizingly. "Go ahead and finish your soup. Then I will have the driver take you back to wherever you are staying." He did not even know where I lived. He did not care. I smiled at him. It was a genuine smile this time. "Thank you, son," I said. "I think I will stay for dessert. I want to savor this moment." "You do that," Brandon said, turning his back on me to talk to a banker. I sat there amidst the noise and the celebration. I watched the ink in my mind fading molecule by molecule. "Enjoy your victory lap, Brandon. Run fast, because you are running on a road that is disappearing beneath your feet. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and when it did, the paper in that briefcase would be blank, and the world would see you for exactly what you are. A king with no crown, a man with no name." I took a bite of bread. I was suddenly very hungry. The hunt was over. Now I just had to wait for the kill. The sun rose over Lake Michigan like a burning coin. It was a beautiful, crisp morning, the kind of autumn day that makes Chicago feel like the center of the world. I stood at the window of my rented apartment, holding a fresh cup of coffee. The steam curled up against the cold glass. From my vantage point on the 32nd floor, I had a direct line of sight into the glass-walled conference room of the First National Bank across the street. It was 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes until the markets opened. 5 minutes until the initial public offering of King Enterprises was supposed to go live. 5 minutes until my son thought he would become a billionaire. I adjusted the focus on my telescope. The image was crystal clear. I could see the condensation on the pitcher of water in the center of their mahogany table. I could see the lead underwriter, a man named Mr. Sterling, checking his watch. And I could see Brandon. He was wearing a navy blue suit that I knew cost $6,000. He was pacing back and forth, his chest puffed out like a rooster. He looked confident. He looked arrogant. He looked like a man who had successfully manipulated his senile old father into signing away a legacy. Vanessa was sitting in the corner chair. She was typing furiously on her phone, probably pre-ordering a new yacht or a vacation home in the Hamptons. They had spent money they did not have yet based on a signature that no longer existed. I took a sip of my coffee. It was black and bitter, just how I liked it. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door to the conference room opened. A notary public walked in, followed by 2 compliance officers from the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was the moment of truth. The document I had signed last night needed to be verified and filed before the trading bell rang. I watched Brandon smile. It was a wide, predatory smile. He picked up the leather briefcase from the table. He unlocked the clasps. Click, click. He opened the lid and pulled out the document. The transfer of voting rights. He slid it across the table to Mr. Sterling with a flourish. I leaned closer to the telescope. I held my breath. Sterling put on his reading glasses. He picked up the document. He looked at the first page. He nodded. Then he flipped to the last page, the signature page. Sterling stopped. He frowned. He tilted his head. He took off his glasses, wiped them with a cloth, and put them back on. He looked at the paper again. Then he looked up at Brandon. I could not hear the words, but I could read the body language perfectly. Sterling was asking a question, a very specific question. Where is it? Brandon laughed. I saw his shoulders shake. He thought Sterling was making a joke. He walked around the table and leaned over Sterling's shoulder. He pointed to the bottom of the page, and then he froze. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. He grabbed the paper from Sterling's hand. He held it up to the light. He flipped it over. He shook it as if the ink was hiding inside the fibers and just needed to be coaxed out. But there was no ink. The chemical compound in my antique pen had done its work. The oxygen in the room had reacted with the pigment, breaking down the bonds at a molecular level. The blue signature I had scrawled with such dramatic trembling last night had evaporated into thin air. The line marked Grantor was empty, pristine, white as snow. I let out a low chuckle that rumbled in my chest. Panic erupted in the conference room. It was like watching a silent movie of a riot. Brandon was screaming. He was pointing at the paper, then pointing at the door, then pointing at himself. Vanessa jumped up from her chair. She snatched the paper from him. She stared at it. She ran her finger across the blank space where my name used to be. She turned on Brandon. Her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She slapped him, hard, right there in front of the bankers and the federal regulators. But the real damage was happening outside that room. I looked down at the tablet I had set up on my windowsill. It was streaming the financial news channel. The ticker at the bottom of the screen turned red. King Enterprises, P.O. halted. Then the headline changed. Rumors swirl Augustus King withdraws support. I had made a call to Mitchell Graves at 8:30 a.m. Mitchell had a contact at the Wall Street Journal. He had whispered a simple sentence. The old man did not sign. The market reacts to uncertainty like a herd of gazelles reacts to a gunshot. Panic is faster than light. I watched the stock graph for King Enterprises. It had opened at $40 a share in the pre-market trading. In 10 seconds, it dropped to 32. In 30 seconds, it was at 25. Back in the conference room, Sterling was standing up. He was gathering his things. He was shaking his head. The deal was dead. Without the voting rights, Brandon did not have the authority to issue new shares. The IPO was illegal. Brandon grabbed Sterling by the lapels of his jacket. He was begging. He was pleading. He was probably telling them that I had signed it, that he saw me sign it, that it was some kind of magic trick. But bankers do not believe in magic. They believe in ink. And there was no ink. Security guards entered the room. They pulled Brandon off of Sterling. My son, the CEO, the genius, the future of the industry, was being physically restrained in his own bank. Vanessa was on her phone now. She was frantic. I knew who she was calling. She was calling me. My burner phone started buzzing on the floor. I let it dance across the hardwood. I did not pick it up. I would never pick it up again. I watched Brandon slump into a chair. He put his head in his hands. He looked small. He looked broken. But I felt no pity. I remembered the cell I had slept in for 730 nights. I remembered the smell of the prison toilet. I remembered the shame of being branded a child killer. This was not cruelty. This was education. My son was learning his first real lesson in business. A contract is only as good as the man who signs it. And if you betray the man who built the table, do not be surprised when he pulls the chair out from under you. The stock price hit $15. The trading was suspended by the exchange. The King Empire had lost 60% of its value in 12 minutes. The loans that Brandon and Vanessa had taken out against the stock were now underwater. The margin calls would start within the hour. By lunchtime, they would be insolvent. I finished my coffee. It was cold now, but it still tasted sweet. I walked over to the whiteboard where I had written my plan. Next to the words, the IPO, I drew a thick red line. Done. I looked back out the window. Brandon was being escorted out of the room by security. He looked up. For a second, he looked straight at my building. He could not see me. I was just a shadow in a high tower. But he knew. He knew I was watching. I raised my empty coffee mug in a silent toast. Good morning, Brandon. Welcome to the real world. The stock market crash was only the opening act. The main event was about to begin in my living room. Down on the street, I could see news vans clogging the intersection of Michigan Avenue. Reporters were shouting into microphones trying to explain why a billion-dollar company had evaporated in 10 minutes. They were blaming market volatility. They were blaming regulatory oversight. They were missing the story. I turned away from the window. Mitchell Graves was standing in the center of my empty apartment. He had set up a simple tripod with a high-definition camera. There were no lights, no makeup, no script, just a plain white wall and a wooden chair. Are you ready? Mitchell asked, checking the audio levels. Once we go live, there is no taking it back. This will be broadcast to every financial news network and social media platform in the country. I buttoned my jacket. I did not look like a tycoon today. I looked like a survivor. Turn it on, I said. Mitchell tapped the screen. The red light on the camera blinked on. I sat down in the chair. I looked directly into the lens. I imagined I was looking into Brandon's eyes. My name is Augustus King, I began. My voice was low and steady. For the last 40 years, you have known me as the builder of this city. You have known me as a CEO, a philanthropist, a father. But for the last 2 years, you have known me as something else. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. The viewer count on the laptop screen facing me was climbing vertically. 10,000, 50,000, 200,000. The world loved a train wreck, and I was giving them a front row seat. You know me as a criminal, I continued. You know me as the man who pushed his pregnant daughter-in-law down a flight of stairs. You know me as the monster who killed his own grandchild. I went to prison for that crime. I spent 730 nights in a 6 by 8 foot cell. I lost my home. I lost my reputation. And I lost the love of my only son. I reached down and picked up the brown envelope that Mitchell had given me in the diner. I pled guilty because I wanted to protect my family. I thought my son was grieving. I thought I was taking the burden of a tragic accident onto my own shoulders. But I was wrong. It was not an accident. And it was not a tragedy. It was a play. And I was the only one who did not know his lines. I opened the envelope. The sound of the paper rustling was the only noise in the room. I held up the first document. It was blown up so the camera could read the text clearly. "This is a medical record from the Santa Maria Clinic in Guadalajara, Mexico," I said, pointing to the date. "It is dated 8 years ago. The patient is listed as Elena Rodriguez. But if you look at the social security number and the biometric data attached to the file, you will see that Elena Rodriguez is the woman you know as Vanessa King." I let that sink in. I watched the comments section on the laptop. It was a blur of text. People were shocked. They were tagging news outlets. The hashtag Justice for Augustus was already trending. I flipped to the next page. "This is a surgical report," I said, my voice hardening. "It details a procedure called a total abdominal hysterectomy. For those of you who are not doctors, that means the surgical removal of the uterus. This surgery was performed on June 12, 2014. I leaned closer to the camera. My eyes bored into the lens. "Do the math," I whispered. "If Vanessa King had her uterus removed 8 years ago, then it is physically impossible for her to have been pregnant 2 years ago." I slammed the papers down on my knee. There was no baby. There was no miscarriage. There was no murder. The fall down the stairs was a stunt performed by a failed actress who wanted to get rid of an inconvenient father-in-law. And the blood on her dress was fake. I picked up the next document. It was the transfer deed for the stock. "And here is the motive," I said. 2 weeks after I was sentenced to prison, my son Brandon transferred $50 million worth of stock into a trust controlled by his grieving wife. He paid her for the loss of a child that never existed. I looked at the camera with a mixture of sadness and fury. I went to prison for a lie. I sat in a cage while they lived in my house, drank my wine, and spent my money. They thought I would die in there. They thought I would come out broken and ashamed. They thought I would crawl away and hide. But I am not hiding. I stood up. I walked toward the camera until my face filled the frame. "Brandon, I know you are watching this. I know you are sitting in that office right now watching your stock price hit 0. I want you to know something. I did not destroy your company today. You destroyed it. You destroyed it the moment you chose a lie over your own father." I took a deep breath. "To the investors of King Enterprises, I apologize. You put your faith in a fraud. To the public who hated me, I forgive you. You were deceived just as I was. But to Brandon and Vanessa, hear me clearly. I am coming for everything. I am suing for malicious prosecution. I am suing for defamation. I am suing for the return of every single asset you stole. And I will not stop until the only thing you own is the orange jumpsuit that is waiting for you." I signaled to Mitchell. "Cut it." The red light went off. The room was silent again. But outside, the world had changed. Mitchell looked at the laptop. His mouth was slightly open. "Gus," he said quietly, "you have 3 million live viewers. The feed is being rebroadcast on CNN and Fox News. The police commissioner just issued a statement saying they are reopening the case based on new evidence." I walked over to the window. I looked down at the street. The crowd of reporters had doubled. But now they were not looking up at my building. They were looking across the street at the office tower. They were looking for the villains. I saw a police cruiser pull up to the front entrance of King Enterprises. Then another. Then a third. The court of public opinion had reached a verdict in record time, and now the real law was coming to enforce it. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't happiness. It was lighter than that. It was the lifting of a weight I had carried for 2 years. The stain was gone. The label of child killer was gone. I sat back down in the wooden chair. My hands were finally steady. "What are the comments saying, Mitchell?" I asked. Mitchell scrolled through the feed. "They are saying you are a hero, Gus. They are saying they hope Vanessa rots. They are asking if you need money for legal fees. Someone just started a GoFundMe for you, and it already has $50,000 in it." I laughed. A dry, humorless laugh. "Tell them I do not need their money," I said. "I will have plenty of my own very soon." Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was not the burner phone. It was my old personal cell number, which I had reactivated just minutes before the broadcast. I looked at the screen. Incoming call, Brandon. I stared at the name. I remembered the little boy who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. I remembered the teenager who I taught to drive. I remembered the young man I had proudly walked into the boardroom. Mitchell watched me. "Are you going to answer it?" he asked. I let it ring. I thought about what he would say. He would cry. He would say Vanessa made him do it. He would say he was scared. He would use the same manipulative tactics he had used his whole life. I pressed the button on the side of the phone, silencing the call. "No," I said. "I have nothing left to say to him. The next time we speak, it will be under oath." I stood up and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" Mitchell asked, grabbing his coat. "I am going across the street," I said. "I want to be there when they bring them out. I want to look him in the eye one last time, not as his father, but as the man who beat him." We took the elevator down. The lobby was empty, but the street was a madhouse. As soon as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, someone recognized me. "That is him. That is Augustus King," a woman shouted. Suddenly, the cameras turned. The microphones were shoved in my face. But I did not stop. I did not speak. I walked through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. My eyes were fixed on the revolving doors of the office building. I was not running from the shame anymore. I was walking toward justice, and justice was about to walk out those doors in handcuffs. The door to my apartment did not open. It exploded inward. The cheap wood frame splintered under the force of a desperate kick. I did not flinch. I sat in the single wooden chair in the center of the room, facing the entrance like a judge waiting for the accused. Brandon stumbled into the room first. He looked like a man who had been running from a fire only to realize he was burning from the inside out. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder. His tie was loose. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with a madness I had never seen before. Vanessa followed him close behind. She looked less like a human being and more like a cornered rat. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streaks, but her hands were curled into claws. "You ruined me," Brandon screamed. His voice was raw, a guttural sound that tore at his throat. "You ruined everything." He lunged at me. For a moment I saw the violence in his eyes. He raised his fist. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders. This was the boy I had taught to fish. Now he wanted to beat me. He wanted to silence the truth with his hands, because he could no longer do it with his lies. I did not move. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I just looked at him. Mitchell Graves stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen. He did not speak. He just racked the slide of his legal carry pistol. The metallic click was louder than Brandon's screaming. Brandon froze. His fist hovered in the air inches from my face. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down. "Sit down, Brandon," I said quietly. My voice was calm, cold, and devoid of any fatherly warmth. He didn't sit. He backed away, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Why are you doing this?" he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are supposed to be my father. You are supposed to protect me. So what if we took the company? It was going to be mine anyway. You are old. You are past your prime." "We needed the money." Vanessa interjected. "Don't drag me into this, Brandon. This was your idea. You said he was weak. You said he would never fight back." I looked at them. They were already turning on each other. The rats were eating their own tails. I stood up slowly. I picked up a single piece of paper from the small table beside me. It was not a medical record. It was not a bank transfer. It was a printout of an encrypted email. "I have one question for you, Brandon," I said. "And I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Because the police are already in the elevator." Brandon stopped pacing. He looked at the door, then back at me. "Did she fool you?" I asked. "Did Vanessa trick you into thinking she was pregnant? Or did you know?" Brandon blinked. He looked at Vanessa. She was glaring at him, daring him to speak. She lied to me," Brandon stammered. He looked back at me, his eyes filling with fake tears. "Dad, I swear. I didn't know. I thought the baby was real. I grieved for that child. I sent you to prison because I was in pain. I am a victim here too." I looked at him with profound sadness. Even at the end, even with the noose around his neck, he was still a coward. I held up the paper. "Stop lying," I said. My voice cracked slightly. For the first time today, I felt the true weight of the betrayal. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the prison time. It was this. "This is an email," I continued. "It was sent from your private server to Vanessa 3 weeks before the accident. Mitchell's forensic team decrypted it this morning." I began to read. Subject: the exit strategy. Body: Vanessa, we need to accelerate the timeline. Dad is asking too many questions about the trust fund. If he finds out I borrowed against the company assets, we are finished. You need to stage the miscarriage soon. Make it dramatic. Make sure there are witnesses. If we can pin it on him, we can trigger the morality clause in the bylaws and force him out. I don't care what it takes. Just get it done." I lowered the paper. The room was deadly silent. The only sound was the distant wail of sirens getting closer. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew she couldn't get pregnant. You knew there was no baby. You weren't a grieving father, Brandon. You were the director of the play. You sent me to prison not because you were angry, but because it was the most convenient way to cover up your embezzlement." Brandon's face crumbled. The mask of the victim fell away, revealing the monster underneath. He didn't look sorry. He looked caught. "You didn't give me a choice," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You were always so perfect. Augustus King, the great businessman, you never let me lead. You never let me fail. I needed the money because I made bad bets. I owed people. Dangerous people. I had to get you out of the way." "You could have asked me," I said. "I would have given you the money. I would have sold the company to save you." "No, you wouldn't." Brandon laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "You would have lectured me. You would have looked at me with that disappointment. That disappointment is worse than prison, Dad." I looked at my son, and in that moment I realized that my son had died a long time ago. The man standing in front of me was a stranger. A dangerous, greedy stranger. "You are right," I said. "I am disappointed. But not because you failed in business. I am disappointed because you failed as a human being." Vanessa rushed toward the window, looking down at the police cars surrounding the building. "We have to go," she screamed, grabbing Brandon's arm. "We have to leave now. The helicopter is on the roof of the office. If we can get to the helipad, we can make it to the private jet." Brandon pulled away from her. He looked at me one last time. There was no love in his eyes, only hate. "This isn't over," he said. "I will fight you. I will use every dime I have left to destroy you." "You don't have a dime left," I said simply. "I froze the accounts 10 minutes ago." The blood drained from his face. The elevator chimed in the hallway. Heavy footsteps approached the door. I sat back down in my chair. I did not look at them. I looked at the blank wall. "Goodbye, Brandon," I said. The police burst into the room, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Get on the ground, hands behind your head." I heard the struggle. I heard Vanessa screaming obscenities. I heard the click of handcuffs, but I did not turn around. I could not bear to watch. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my family being dragged away. I was free. I was vindicated. I was the winner. So why did it feel like I had just lost everything? The private terminal at O'Hare International Airport is designed for people who do not wait in lines. It is a place of quiet luxury where billionaires and celebrities sip espresso while their luggage is loaded onto Gulfstream jets. It is a place where money usually solves every problem. But today, money was not the solution. It was the evidence. Vanessa King drove her Mercedes G-Wagon onto the tarmac, bypassing the security checkpoint, with a badge she had stolen from Brandon S.'s desk months ago. She was driving fast, too fast. The tires screeched as she drifted around a fuel truck, narrowly missing a collision. She slammed on the brakes next to the sleek white jet that bore the King Enterprises logo on the tail. Inside the car, Vanessa was hyperventilating. She grabbed the Louis Vuitton duffel bag from the passenger seat. It was heavy. It was stuffed with $2 million in cash that she had liquidated from the emergency corporate accounts before I froze them. It also contained her jewelry box filled with diamonds she had bought with my money. She kicked the car door open and stumbled out. Her high heels broke on the asphalt, but she did not stop. She kicked off her shoes and ran barefoot toward the stairs of the jet. Her hair was wild, her makeup was smeared. She looked like a banshee fleeing a burning house. "Get the engine started," she screamed at the pilot, who was standing at the bottom of the stairs. "We need to leave now. Right now." The pilot. A man named Captain Miller, whom I had employed for 15 years, did not move. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, wearing his sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. He looked at Vanessa with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "I said move, you idiot." Vanessa shrieked, throwing the heavy bag onto the steps. "Do you know who I am? I own this plane. I pay your salary. Get in the cockpit and fly, or I will have you fired and blacklisted before we land." Captain Miller shook his head slowly. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mrs. King," he said calmly. "The flight plan has been rejected." "Rejected?" Vanessa yelled, her voice cracking. "What do you mean rejected? We are a private flight. We do not need permission. Just fly. Go to the Cayman Islands. Go anywhere. Just get me off the ground." Captain Miller took a step back. "The Federal Aviation Administration has grounded this aircraft, Mrs. King," he said. "The registration has been flagged as seized property involved in a federal investigation. If I turn those engines on, I will lose my license and go to prison. I am not going to prison for you." Vanessa stared at him. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. She looked at the plane. It was right there. Her escape pod. Her freedom. It was so close she could touch the cold aluminum skin. But it might as well have been on the moon. She grabbed the bag again. "Fine," she spat. "I will find another plane. I will charter a helicopter. I will walk if I have to." She turned to run back to her car. But it was too late. The sound of sirens cut through the air. It was not the wail of a single police car. It was a chorus. A symphony of authority. 3 black SUVs sped onto the tarmac from the perimeter gate. They moved in a synchronized formation, cutting off her escape route. They boxed in the Mercedes. They boxed in the plane. They boxed in Vanessa. She dropped the bag. The zipper burst open, spilling stacks of $100 bills onto the oily pavement. The wind caught the money, blowing it across the tarmac like dead leaves. Vanessa looked around wildly. She looked for a gap. She looked for a place to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The tarmac was a flat, open desert of concrete. The doors of the SUVs opened. These were not local police officers. These were federal agents. They wore blue windbreakers with yellow letters on the back. FBI. They did not run. They walked with the heavy measured steps of inevitable justice. They had their weapons drawn but pointed low. They knew she was not armed with a gun. She was armed with something much more dangerous. Lies. Vanessa started to scream. It was a sound that did not sound human. It was a high-pitched shriek of pure, primal terror. She fell to her knees in the middle of the scattered money. She started gathering the bills, trying to stuff them back into the bag. Her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't hold on to them. "No, no, no," she sobbed, clawing at the asphalt. "This is mine. This is my money. You cannot take it. I am Vanessa King. I am a victim. My husband abused me. I am fleeing for my life." An agent stepped forward. He was a tall man with a grim face. He kicked the bag away from her. "Vanessa King," he said, his voice booming over the wind. "You are under arrest." Vanessa lunged at him. She tried to bite his leg. She was not a sophisticated socialite anymore. She was a feral animal. She scratched and kicked, spitting at the agents. "Get off me!" she screamed as two agents grabbed her arms. "Do you know who I am?" "I will sue you. I will sue the government. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," the agent said, forcing her hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked. It was a sharp, metallic sound, the sound of a steel trap snapping shut. Vanessa thrashed against the restraints. She looked up at the sky, screaming at God, screaming at the universe, screaming at me. "It is a mistake," she wailed. "He set me up. Augustus King set me up. He is the criminal. Ask my husband. Ask Brandon." The agent leaned down close to her ear. "We have spoken to your husband, Mrs. King," the agent said. "And we have spoken to Mr. Mitchell Graves. We have the wire transfer records. We have the emails. We have the sworn affidavit from the clinic in Mexico. We know about the perjury. We know about the money laundering. We know about the fake pregnancy." Vanessa stopped screaming. She went limp. Her eyes went wide. She realized that the wall of lies she had built brick by brick over the last 2 years had not just cracked. It had collapsed and buried her alive. The agents hauled her to her feet. She had lost one of her diamond earrings in the struggle. Her designer dress was torn and stained with grease from the tarmac. She looked small. She looked pathetic. They dragged her toward the waiting SUV. She dragged her feet, leaving a trail of scuff marks on the ground. "My money," she whispered. "My diamonds." "They are evidence now," the agent said, pushing her into the back seat. As the door slammed shut, I imagined the sound echoing all the way back to the city. It was the end of the performance. The curtain had fallen. I was not at the airport. I was sitting in my apartment, watching the live feed from a news helicopter that was circling overhead. I watched the black SUVs drive away in a convoy. I watched the wind blow the loose $100 bills across the empty runway. Vanessa had wanted to live a life of high-flying luxury. She had wanted to be untouchable. And now she was. She was in the custody of the United States government. She was going to a place where her charm, her lies, and her fake tears would have no currency. She was trading a Gulfstream jet for a prison van. She was trading a mansion for a cage. She was trading my life for hers. I turned off the television. The silence in the apartment was beautiful. Mitchell Graves walked in from the other room holding a bottle of vintage scotch. "Did they get her?" he asked. I nodded. They got her. Mitchell poured 2 glasses. To justice, he said, raising his glass. I looked at the amber liquid. No, Mitchell, I said. To the truth. Justice is what the court gives you. Truth is what you take for yourself. I took a sip. It burned going down. A good burn. A cleansing burn. The queen had fallen. The knight was in checkmate. The board was clear. Now it was time to rebuild the kingdom. The courtroom was silent, but it was the kind of silence that screams. It was the airless vacuum before a thunderstorm. I sat at the plaintiff table to the right of the aisle. My suit was pressed crisp and dark charcoal gray. I sat with my back straight, my hands folded on the table. I looked like the man I used to be, the man who commanded boardrooms, the man who built skyscrapers. On the other side of the aisle sat Brandon. He looked like a ghost of the man who had thrown me a check in that motel room just days ago. His suit was rumpled, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. He had not shaved. His eyes darted around the room looking for an exit, looking for a friend, looking for salvation. But there was none. Vanessa was in federal custody awaiting her own arraignment. His lawyers, the best defense team money could buy, had resigned yesterday when his assets were frozen. He was left with a court-appointed attorney, a young woman who looked terrified to be sitting next to the most hated man in Chicago. Judge Harrison entered the room. He was a stern man with a face carved from granite. He took his seat and looked over his spectacles at the courtroom. He did not look at me. He looked at Brandon. And in that look, I saw the verdict before a single word was spoken. Mitchell Graves stood up. He did not walk to the podium. He stood right there at our table, his hand resting on a stack of files that was 6 inches thick. Your Honor, Mitchell, began, his voice resonating off the mahogany walls. We are not here today to debate whether Brandon King is a bad son. Being a bad son is not a crime. We are here to prove that he is a thief, a fraud, and a conspirator who engaged in a systemic campaign to destroy his father for financial gain. Mitchell picked up the first document. We have presented the court with the emails decrypted from the defendant's private server. These emails prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brandon King knew his wife Vanessa King was physically incapable of bearing children. Yet he used the alleged death of a non-existent child as the pretext to force his father to plead guilty to a crime that never happened. Brandon jumped up. I didn't know, he shouted, his voice cracking. She lied to me too. I am a victim here. Sit down, Mr. King, the judge barked. His gavel struck the wood like a gunshot. You will have your turn to speak, or I will have you removed. Brandon sank back into his chair. He looked small. He looked defeated. Mitchell continued as if the interruption had never happened. We have also presented bank records showing that the defendant embezzled $12 million from the corporate accounts prior to the IPO attempt. He used this money to fund a lifestyle of excess while his father sat in a prison cell. He mortgaged the family estate. He leveraged the stock. He turned a legacy into a piggy bank. Mitchell paused. He turned to look directly at Brandon. But the most damning piece of evidence is not financial, Your Honor. It is testamentary. Mitchell walked over to the bench and handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. This is the last will and testament of Beatrice King, the defendant's mother and the plaintiff's late wife. I felt a lump form in my throat. Beatrice. She had been the heart of our family. She had loved Brandon with a ferocity that frightened me sometimes. But she also knew him. She saw the cracks in his character long before I did. Please turn to page 14, Mitchell said. Clause 7, Section B, the morality clause. The judge adjusted his glasses. He read the text silently, moving his lips slightly. Then he looked up at Brandon. Mr. Graves, please read the clause for the court, the judge said. Mitchell cleared his throat. The clause states that the transfer of the family trust and the voting shares is conditional. The beneficiary must maintain a standard of ethical conduct consistent with the values of the King family. If the beneficiary is found by a court of law to have engaged in gross moral turpitude, fraud, or criminal activity against another family member, then the inheritance is immediately voided. Mitchell closed the file. Gross moral turpitude, Mitchell repeated. Framing your father for the murder of your unborn child to cover up theft. I cannot imagine a definition that fits better than that. The young court-appointed lawyer stood up. She tried to object. She stammered something about the clause being vague, about the definition of moral turpitude being subjective. But it was weak. It was a whisper against a hurricane. The judge waved her down. He did not need to hear arguments. The facts were not in dispute. The emails were real. The theft was real. The medical records were real. Judge Harrison looked at Brandon. Mr. King, the judge said, his voice heavy with disdain. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen murderers, rapists, and gang leaders, but I have never seen a case of filial betrayal as cold and calculated as this. You did not just steal your father's money. You stole his time. You stole his freedom. You stole his name. Brandon put his head in his hands. He was shaking. He knew what was coming. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Augustus King, the judge ruled. Based on the evidence presented and the clear language of the morality clause, I hereby rule that Brandon King has forfeited his right to the King Family Trust. The transfer of shares is voided ab initio. The ownership of the King estate is returned immediately to Augustus King. The judge paused. He was not done. Furthermore, the court orders Brandon King to pay restitution in the amount of $22 million for the embezzled funds and the decline in stock value. Additionally, I am awarding punitive damages in the amount of $50 million for malicious prosecution and emotional distress. $72 million. It was a death sentence. Not a physical one, but a financial one. Brandon did not have $72 million. He did not have $72. I order the immediate seizure of all assets held by the defendant, the judge continued. His personal bank accounts, his vehicles, his jewelry, and any real estate holdings. If these assets are insufficient to cover the judgment, his wages will be garnished for the remainder of his natural life. The gavel banged. It sounded like the final nail in a coffin. Court is adjourned. The room erupted into noise. Reporters were shouting questions. The bailiff moved toward Brandon. I stood up. I felt Mitchell's hand on my shoulder. "We did it, Gus," he whispered. "You got it all back." I looked across the aisle. Brandon was sitting alone. His lawyer had already started packing her bag, anxious to get away from the stink of failure. Brandon looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "Dad," he whispered. "Dad, please. I have nowhere to go. They took the house. They took the cards. Vanessa is gone. I have nothing." I walked over to the barrier that separated us. I looked down at him. "You are wrong, Brandon," I said. "You have exactly what you earned." "But what do I do?" he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "How do I live?" I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a $20 bill, the same amount I had used to pay the Uber driver the day I got out of prison. I placed it on the table in front of him. "Take a taxi," I said. "I hear the Motel 6 is hiring cleaners." I turned my back on him. "Dad," he screamed. "Dad, don't walk away." I kept walking. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors opened for me. Light flooded in from the hallway. I walked out into the world. I was Augustus King. I was the owner of King Enterprises. I was the master of my own fate. And for the first time in 2 years, I could breathe. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me, but the hallway was not empty. It was lined with men in dark windbreakers. They were not reporters. They were not curious onlookers. They were the Economic Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I stopped walking. I leaned against the marble wall and folded my arms. I knew why they were here. Mitchell had sent the file on the fraudulent IPO filing to the SEC Enforcement Division 3 hours ago. The wheels of justice usually grind slowly, but when $1 billion disappears in 10 minutes, those wheels spin with terrifying speed. The courtroom doors opened again. Brandon stumbled out. He was walking fast, his head down, trying to push past the reporters who were shouting questions about his bankruptcy. He looked like a man trying to outrun an avalanche. He did not see the agents until he ran right into the chest of the lead officer. Brandon looked up. He blinked. He took a step back. "Excuse me," he muttered, trying to step around the wall of human muscle. "I am in a hurry." "Mr. Brandon King," the agent said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He held up a badge. It caught the light of the camera flashes. "I am Special Agent Miller. We have a warrant for your arrest." Brandon laughed. It was a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "Arrest," he squeaked. "For what?" "I just lost a civil case. I am broke. You cannot arrest me for being broke. You are not being arrested for debt," Mr. King, Agent Miller said, reaching for his belt. "You are being arrested for securities fraud, wire fraud, and forgery of a corporate instrument. You knowingly attempted to list a company on the public exchange using a falsified signature. You misled investors. You manipulated the market." Brandon's face turned the color of ash. He looked at the agents. Then he looked at the cameras. Then he looked at me. I was standing 10 feet away. I did not move. I did not speak. I just watched. "Dad!" He screamed. "Dad, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you signed it. Please, Dad. If I go to federal prison, I will die. I cannot survive in there." I looked at my son. The boy who used to be afraid of the dark was now terrified of the light. I said nothing. My silence was the loudest sound in the corridor. The agent grabbed Brandon's wrist. Brandon tried to pull away. He flailed his arms, knocking over a microphone stand. "Get off me!" he yelled. "Do not touch me. I am a CEO. I am a king." "You are a suspect," Agent Miller said, spinning Brandon around and slamming him against the wall. The sound of his face hitting the plaster made the reporters gasp. "Put your hands behind your back." Brandon started to sob. It was an ugly, wet sound. He stopped fighting. He let his arms go limp. Click, click. The handcuffs went on. They were tight. I could see the metal digging into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. The symbol of his status was now just padding for his restraints. The agents pulled him upright. He could barely stand. His legs were shaking so bad his knees were knocking together. "Dad," Brandon whispered. He was not screaming anymore. He was begging. "Dad, help me." I pushed off the wall and took a step toward him. The agents tensed, but they let me approach. I stood right in front of him. I looked into his eyes. I searched for the son I had raised. I searched for the little boy who used to want to be just like me. But he was gone. All that was left was a stranger who had sold his soul for a seat at a table he did not build. "You wanted to be the boss, Brandon," I said softly. "You wanted to make the big decisions. Well, this is the biggest decision of your life. You decided to be a criminal. Now you have to pay the price." "But I am your son," he wept. "No," I said, shaking my head. "My son died 2 years ago. You are just the man who stole his name." I nodded to the agents. "Take him away." "No, no, no," Brandon wailed as they dragged him down the hallway. I watched him go. I watched the back of his head bobbing up and down as he fought against the agents. I watched the reporters chasing after him like a pack of wolves. I stood there until the elevator doors closed, swallowing him whole. The hallway was suddenly quiet. The flashbulbs stopped popping. The shouting faded. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I thought I would feel guilty. I thought I would feel a pang of regret. But I felt nothing. Just a clean, cold emptiness. It was done. The cancer had been cut out. The wound would heal. It would leave a scar, but scars are just proof that you survived. I straightened my tie. I turned and walked toward the exit. The sun was shining outside. It was a new day. And for the first time in a long time, I had work to do. The smell of a federal penitentiary is something you never forget. It is a mixture of floor wax, industrial disinfectant, and old sweat. For 2 years, that smell was the only air I breathed. I swore the day I walked out that I would never inhale it again. But life has a strange sense of humor. Because exactly 30 days after my release, I found myself walking back through the metal detectors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. But this time, I was not wearing an orange jumpsuit. I was wearing a bespoke Italian suit. I was not shackled. I was a visitor. The guard at the desk recognized me. He was the same man who used to inspect my mail for contraband. He looked at my driver license, then he looked up at me. His eyes went wide. "Mr. King," he stammered. "I saw you on the news. I did not think you would be back." "I am just here to close a chapter, officer," I said, signing the logbook. He buzzed me through. I walked down the long gray corridor. My footsteps clicked sharply on the linoleum. I remembered the shuffle of the inmates. I remembered the heavy, hopeless feeling of walking this hall, knowing there was a cage waiting at the end. Today, I walked with my head high. I entered the visitation room. It was a bleak space divided by a thick pane of reinforced glass. On one side sat the free. On the other side sat the damned. I sat down on the metal stool. It was cold. I folded my hands on the counter and waited. 5 minutes later, the door on the other side opened. A man walked in. At least I think it was a man. He was hunched over, shuffling his feet in cheap canvas slippers. His head had been shaved, revealing a scalp that was pale and vulnerable. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit with a number stenciled on the chest. It was Brandon. He looked 20 years older than the day I saw him in the courtroom. His face was gaunt. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull, surrounded by dark bruises of exhaustion. He sat down slowly, as if his body hurt. He picked up the heavy black phone receiver. His hand was shaking. I picked up mine. "Dad?" he whispered. His voice was tinny and distorted through the speaker. "Hello, Brandon," I said. He started to cry immediately. It wasn't the manipulative crying he used to do. This was the weeping of a broken man. "You have to get me out of here, Dad," he sobbed, pressing his forehead against the glass. "It is hell in here. The other inmates. They know who I am. They know I was rich. They threaten me every day. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. Please. You have money now. You have the company back. Hire the best lawyers. Get me an appeal. Get me out." I watched him. I watched the son I had raised, the boy I had protected from every scrape and bruise. I had created this weakness. I had shielded him so much that he never developed a spine. "I cannot do that, Brandon," I said calmly. "Why not?" he screamed, slamming his hand against the glass. The guard behind him took a step forward, but Brandon didn't notice. "You are my father. You are supposed to help me. Vanessa." It was all Vanessa. She tricked me. She is the villain. I am just a victim. I shook my head slowly. "Vanessa is in a cell just like this one," I said. "And do you know what she told the FBI? She told them everything was your idea. She told them you came up with the plan to fake the miscarriage because you were terrified of telling me about the gambling debts." Brandon's mouth fell open. "She is lying," he gasped. "It doesn't matter who is lying," I said. "What matters is the truth. And the truth is, you are exactly where you belong." I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out a book. It was not a checkbook. It was a thick, leather-bound Bible. It was the same Bible my father had given me when I started the company. I slid it into the metal drawer that allowed items to be passed between visitors and inmates. "I cannot give you a lawyer, Brandon," I said. "And I cannot give you money. Money is what got you in here. Money is the poison that made you sick." Brandon stared at the book. He looked at it with disdain. "What is this?" he spat. "I need a defense team, not a book." "You need salvation, Brandon," I said. "You need to understand that actions have consequences. You need to learn how to be a man without a credit card in your pocket." I stood up. "Dad." "Wait," he panicked. "Where are you going? The visitation time is 20 minutes. You have only been here for fit." "I have said everything I needed to say," I replied. Brandon pressed his face against the glass. His eyes were wide with terror. "Do you hate me?" he asked. His voice was so small it barely came through the speaker. I paused. I looked at the orange jumpsuit. I looked at the shaved head. I felt a pang of sorrow deep in my chest, but it was a distant feeling like remembering a bad dream. "I do not hate you," I said. "Hate takes energy, and I am done wasting my energy on you. I forgive you, Brandon. As a father, I forgive you. As a Christian, I forgive you." Brandon's face lit up with a flicker of hope. "Then get me out," he begged. I leaned close to the glass. "But the law does not forgive you," I said, "and society does not forgive you. You committed a crime. Now you must do the time. Read the book, Brandon. It is the only thing of value I have left to give you." I hung up the phone. "No," Brandon screamed. He started slamming the receiver against the glass. "No, come back. Don't leave me here." "Dad." The guards grabbed him. They pulled him away from the window. He was kicking and screaming, dragging his feet on the floor. I watched until the heavy steel door slammed shut, silencing his cries. I walked out of the visitation room. I walked back down the long gray corridor. I stepped out into the sunlight. The air tasted sweet. It tasted of gasoline and dust and freedom. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs. I did not look back at the prison walls. I walked toward the parking lot where my car was waiting. I had lost a son, but I had found my self-respect, and that was a trade I was willing to make. The park was alive with the colors of autumn. The maple trees were burning red and gold, dropping their leaves onto the emerald grass. Children were running near the fountain, their laughter mixing with the sound of splashing water. It was a scene of perfect innocence. I sat on a wooden bench, wrapping my coat tighter against the chill. Mitchell Graves sat next to me holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He looked different without his tie. He looked younger, lighter. "The paperwork is finalized," Mitchell said, handing me a cup. "The Augustus King Foundation is officially registered." I nodded, taking a sip. "And the mission statement?" Mitchell smiled. "To provide legal and financial aid to the elderly who have been victims of financial abuse by family members." "It is perfect, Gus. We already have 300 applications. There are so many people out there just like you. People who were betrayed by the ones they loved the most." 300, I repeated. "That is 300 tragedies. But maybe we can turn them into 300 new beginnings." I watched a young father pushing his son on a swing set nearby. The boy was laughing, shouting, "Higher, Daddy, higher." The father was laughing too, his face full of adoration. "I used to be him," I said softly, pointing at the father. "I used to think that love was enough. I thought if I loved Brandon enough, he would grow up to be a good man." Mitchell leaned back, stretching his legs. "Love is enough, Gus," he said. But you have to love the right people, and sometimes you have to love yourself enough to walk away from the wrong ones. I looked at my old friend. Mitchell had stood by me when my own blood had turned against me. He had risked his career, his reputation, and his safety to help me find the truth. You know, Mitchell, I said, turning to him, people say blood is thicker than water. They use it to justify staying in toxic relationships. But the full quote is actually, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. I didn't know that. It means the bonds we choose, I explained. The bonds we make through shared struggle and loyalty are stronger than the bonds of biology. You are my family, Mitchell. You and the people we are going to help. That is my legacy now. Mitchell smiled and clinked his paper cup against mine. To family, he said. The real kind. I looked back at the playground. The leaves were falling, swirling in the wind. Winter was coming. But after winter, there would be spring. There would always be spring. I had lost everything, and I had gained everything. I was 72 years old, and my life was just beginning. I looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall for the final time. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, but it was a necessary one. If you are going through something similar, if you feel alone or betrayed, remember that your story does not end in the dark. You have the power to write a new chapter. I am Augustus King, and I am signing off. Through this ordeal, I learned that the deepest wounds often lead to the greatest strength. For years, I defined myself by what I provided for others, my son, my company, my legacy. But when those were stripped away, I found something far more valuable, my own dignity. True family is not determined by DNA, but by loyalty, respect, and who stays when the money runs out. It is never too late to rewrite your ending. You are not a prisoner of your past, and you are certainly not defined by those who betrayed you. Stand tall, speak your truth, and never apologize for protecting your peace. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and redemption. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to cut a toxic family member out of your life? Share your story below. Your experience might just give someone else the courage to save themselves. Until next time.